Hello, I'm Paul Gates. Welcome to this edition of the Academics. This week, everything on the surface changed for us here in North Carolina. Suddenly, we seem to have regressed from the New South to the Old, from one of America's financial capitals to the days of the lunch counter at Woolworth's. Has the progress we thought we'd made in race relations been illusory, or has all along America been transformed in the same ways that has also changed most of Europe? And what has all this got to do with the upcoming election? We're going to discuss it today. Our panel, Nancy Love of Appalachian State's Department of Government and Justice Studies, Michael Wade of our History Department, and Dave Spiceland of the Department of Communication. So, panel, a lot has changed, developed, maybe we should say, since we were together last week. What is going on in Charlotte? I mean, this is riots and so forth, demonstrations at least, precipitated by yet another shooting of a black motorist by a police officer. Starting with Ferguson, this is almost an all too frequent occurrence. And what's keeping this going?
Well, let's maybe talk about who the players are, if you will. We've got the media, we've got the protesters, we've got the police, we've got the public, we've got the officials, and all of those play a different role. And the media can either report and or fuel situations and make a bad situation even worse.
Well, what does it say when a large segment of the population is afraid of the people who are supposed to be protecting us? This is a different, quantitatively different relationship between segments of society.
Well, I think we have a deeper issue. People are rising up against long-standing systems of injustice. And that distrust of the police in this particular case is coming so far from a lack of transparency. The family has now been permitted to see the videos that exist, one from a body cam, one from a dash cam, and they're calling for their release to the public, but they haven't yet been released to the public. And it's not about the police per se so much as it is about a culture of policing and police who are perhaps too quick to kill and due to fear on both sides.
Is that the reason that the police have not released the videos? Is it to show something that would reflect negatively on the police?
What I've seen so far, the family statement was that the videos were not definitive about what Keith Scott was carrying in his hands, whether it was a book or a gun, but that his hands were at his side and he was backing up from the officer who fired the shots, who I think it's important to say, Brentley Vinson is also a black man.
The police officer
Yes.
who shot, yes. Does it matter, Mike, whether it was a gun or a book? I mean, we've got the same result here.
Well, it's going to matter for the person who fired the shots. We now know that the person who fired the shots in Tulsa has been indicted for manslaughter, and she will be looking at a minimum of 4 years in prison.
And that was a white female police officer.
That was a white female police officer. I don't understand what exactly takes so long when you've got camera material. I think it was in Tulsa. They put the video cam evidence out almost right away, and in fact, yesterday the mayor said that is was probably the main factor in there being no violence in Tulsa.
Am I remembering correctly that very shortly after the shooting in Tulsa, the federal government opened an investigation? Is that, am I remembering the right shooting. Of course, now I'm getting my shootings confused. But such has not happened in Charlotte.
Yeah, I don't know that. The SBI is now investigating Charlotte. I think they moved in yesterday. But I also think that something was said just a bit earlier. I believe I heard if I heard the news correctly last night, the police chief in Charlotte has said that the video will not be released to the public. I did find one thing was interesting. The news showed the family walking out of the building after they had seen the video, and they were notably, I thought, silent. Part of it was might certainly have been due to shock, but I found myself thinking that if the video had in fact been definitive, they might have had something to say.
It might have been more of a reaction.
Yeah, I think it would have been human to say this. Demonstrates that what we have suspected is true, and not even the lawyer who spoke very briefly said that. He said there's some things to think about.
There's a certain frustration that I feel because we're in 20-some minutes, we're going to, and we're not going to try to solve a problem, but we've got a lot of systemic kind of issues going on. Now, and Nancy, you mentioned what was the climate of, I didn't catch all that, in terms of law enforcement or whatever.
I mentioned a culture of violence, and
among law enforcement officials.
I would say more broadly in American society right now. I think we have violent rhetoric in our presidential campaign, and then we have violence in the streets, which involves police officers and protesters.
Now, what about the rule of law? We use that term sometimes. If we don't have police or some sort of enforcement, what do we do in terms of society? And it is frustrating for, of course, various communities when people are shot or whatever. But what do we do if we don't have law enforcement?
Well, it's not an argument against policing or an argument against law enforcement. It's an argument against what some are protesting as bad policing. And because we don't have apparently a definitive video, but then we also haven't seen the video to make our own judgments about whether or not it contributes to a different story. It's hard to know exactly what transpired.
Well, and the police chief initially said that there were outside agitators. Now, that was the first night. I don't know if there were, what he was talking about, but if there are outside people from outside the Charlotte area coming in and making a bad situation even worse, I mean, is that not a good thing?
Well, the Justice Department has sent 4 members of its Community Relations Service now, and the Congressional Black Caucus has also visited Loretta Lynch asking for additional support from the
Justice?
Yeah.
And Nancy brings up this issue of the culture of violence, because remember, we've certainly got police on civilian shootings, but we've also had civilians on police shootings a few weeks ago, a month ago.
And civilian on civilian.
And civilians on civilians in Charlotte, apparently. That's a dangerous stew, that all this comes together in these horrible incidents.
Well, I think, and I have no hidden motive in saying this, the United States is one of the most violent cultures in the world. It just is, ranging. We've got guns all over the place, but there's a great deal of violence in both urban America and rural America. Much of it, like poverty, unseen. Rural Maine, for example, has perhaps the worst drug problems in the United States. And add to that what looks like I think there's been a growing polarization in not only in American society, but between law enforcement and communities over a period of time. I don't really, I'm struggling to remember if there was this level of killings by police of civilians that was like this any time in the past 30 or 40 years. And I don't think so.
Yeah, I've thought about that too. And can't come up with examples, as you say, Mike, but is this just because of all of a sudden there's body cams and civilians everybody has a cell phone with video capability?
You would think that if body cams were out there, there would be fewer rather than more.
But is it just because they're coming to our attention because of the technology? Everybody is a videographer now.
Well, the people are less inclined, whether they're right or wrong is another thing, they're less inclined to sit still for it. But something Dave said earlier, do we not still need police? Yeah, we do. And yeah, I think the police chief in Charlotte is right to make a point of arresting the looters. And I think that probably what he said on television yesterday may have had something to do with there being a lot less, well, almost no violence, I guess, last night.
Also the curfew.
Is it possible, though, that this is a problem of the heart? You know, every time there's a shooting, President Obama comes out, calls for gun control, et cetera, and never talks about the heart. If this is a problem of the heart, how do we fix it, if that's possible? We can take all the guns off the street, but we'll still have a problem with the heart. And I think it's a frustration there. What do we do? Do we just pass more laws? Is that going to be the solution?
No,
and I would suggest it's not. But I think that's something to think about.
I agree that it's a problem of the heart and the heart of our democracy. And part of fixing it, I think, is to know our history. This didn't emerge out of the blue. And one of the things that I was thinking about, you asked, does it matter whether the victim was reading a book or carrying a gun? It's not illegal to have a gun in North Carolina, for one. And schools were desegregated not so long ago, right? The Brown decision of 1954, and it was illegal to teach a slave to read or for a slave to read pre-Civil War. So the symbolism, right, of a black man in a car reading a book and carrying a gun, perhaps it was both, we don't know, is important historically. And for our hearts as well as our minds
to
get
cause
around that.
The event, though, just because he's reading a book? I'm confused by where you're going with the symbolism. What does that mean?
You want to? What I'm saying is that there's a longer history of expectations about what is normal behavior. And for a black man to be reading a book, sitting in a parked car, and to get out of the car with something in his hands, or for a black man to be in his car and have a gun for his protection.
I have a question. Was he in the car when he was approached by the police?
I haven't seen the video either.
My understanding is he got out of the car, then the police started approaching him, and he got back in the car, only to get out again when he was, and that's when he was shot.
Okay.
Not clear on what the reason for him getting back in was, or getting back out, maybe on police orders. I don't know that, Mike.
The reason I kept silent when you was I didn't have anything really to add to what you and Dave were talking about. But one thing that occurs to me is, call it a problem of the heart, there's a deep, systemic problem in this country. That it's unemployment, a culture of violence, educational systems, including in Charlotte, that are just plain failing, as much because of the politicians as because of the education establishment itself, which needs attention. There's a whole litany of problems that one could go on with from there. Too many single-parent families, and none of that gets addressed. But here's the other thing. the Trump supporters are angry because they think the system is broken. These people are also angry because they think the system is broken. I think that's one thing they can agree on. And I think it's high time in this country that we had elections and election discussions that focused on problems on which there's a large measure of agreement. You know, maybe then some of the shouting can stop. Probably not. But at least, you know, maybe people can get on something like the same page. And you know, we've got an election for president. We've got an election for governor here in North Carolina.
And the Senate too.
And the Senate.
Yeah.
And whoever wins will win, obviously. But I think the electorate's probably going to lose. And one of the reasons they're going to lose is they're quite likely, we are quite likely, to go out and elect the same people to Congress and to the state legislature who have not only not done anything about these problems, they've actually contributed to them.
You know, we touched back on education there for a second, and I think it may be worth pointing out that, you know, Nancy mentioned the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, and failing schools that you mentioned, Mike. Despite the Brown decision, the school segregation or desegregation didn't get really straightened out in any meaningful way until the late 70s at the earliest, and,
Well,
and still is not.
The fall of 1970 was the first year of region-wide desegregation in the South, and part of the problem after that was, well, there was always an institutional problem with education, too big being one of them. But I think both black parents and white parents sort of withdrew their attention and support from the schools because neither side, each for their own reason, could come to grips with the fact of desegregation, which is different from integration. Discipline slipped, has slipped over the last 4 decades. Schools have grown ever larger. The courts have withdrawn support from school efforts to maintain order. Politicians have withdrawn funding. And the stock answer, as well as it's the fault of the teachers.
Well, when I was going to school a long time ago, back in the 1960s, you know, I went to a school where every day I would get beaten up, I would have bullying, and we're talking about the 1960s, and I would come home and report this to my parents, and I was told, well, you need to, you know, think about, you know, you're a Christian and you're supposed to do this or that, and that didn't solve the problem. And even today, I was talking to somebody on the way over here, and they had a friend who was in another state, and she said that the students can cuss the teacher, that's the way it was put, and got right in this teacher's face and was very confrontational, and the teacher can't do anything. Is it a discipline problem? Is it an issue of the parents not being supportive of the system? Frankly, I wish I were more involved when my kids went to Watauga High School to find out what they were being taught. And some of the things they were being taught surprised me when I found out years later. And so it's more than just parents' involvement. It's
also parenting.
Parenting, yeah, and taking whatever they learn and trying to make something out of it when they come home, but you've got both parents working. If you've got both parents, it's frustrating.
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, you're bringing up culture here to a certain extent, Dave, and you know, if we could make that, talk about political culture a little bit, the electorate. Bloomberg Business Week has an entire issue this week devoted to the electorate. And it makes great use of data analytics to compare various demographic qualities of the electorate, and draws some interesting conclusions. It would take a long time to go through this. Certainly, I haven't read it all yet. But the electorate itself, the question I think is, has it changed? And one thing I ran across in the Chronicle of Higher Ed this morning, just before I came over, was, we've talked about the protests closing down some streets in downtown Charlotte. And there was a University of Tennessee law professor who apparently yesterday tweeted his followers, of whom there are quite a few, I gather, suggesting that motorists should respond to these blocked streets by running them down. And his Twitter account was suspended until the tweet was deleted. Apparently he has it back now. But I'm stunned by the fact that this was a law professor.
Was it a metaphor? Was it something where he was defending by, well, it was just a joke?
Well, you never know with Twitter, of course. 140 characters, you can't say much.
Yeah.
But I think the way it was originally, or probably reasonably taken, was a critique of protesters.
I think we should all remember that despite common usage, the root word of Twitter is twit and not tweet.
Well, this is maybe my social media moment to mention hashtag blackout. Our students have been urging people to wear all black to show support given the recent injustices for fellow brothers and sisters. And so that's among the reasons I'm wearing black, though not a great TV color. And then your segue into this was about the candidates. And both Clinton and Trump have made statements on the shootings in Charlotte. And what Hillary has said, there's still much we don't know about what happened in both incidents, but we do know that we have 2 more names to add to a list of African Americans killed by police officers in these encounters. It's unbearable and it needs to become intolerable. We also saw the targeting of police officers in Philadelphia last week, and last night in Charlotte, 12 officers, I've seen different numbers, but were injured in demonstrations following Keith Scott's death. Everyday police officers are serving with courage, honor, and skill. And then Donald Trump has said on Twitter, hopefully the violence and unrest in Charlotte will come to an immediate end. To those injured, get well soon. We need unity and leadership.
Well, is Charlotte really this divided? I mean, it's always been regarded as kind of a sleepy southern town. Banking came, made it the banking center of the country. Did anything else change? I mean, is this?
There's all, I've read the Charlotte paper now for over 30 years, and what Charlotte presents to the world or to the country has always struck me as sort of a fairly thin veneer. My first experience with Charlotte was back in the 1970s when I was offered a job there, and in 2 days, my immediate impression was this is a pretty racist southern town. Now, I think some things have changed since then, but I think a lot of it hasn't. I read the letters to the editor in the Charlotte paper with pretty good regularity, and there's some pretty ignorant stuff that gets expressed in there, and I mean that in the clinical sense, that people just don't know what they're talking about.
Well, we're glad you didn't take that job, Mike.
I am too.
And the rest of us have been, in North Carolina for quite a while too. What do you think about that? Mike's impression is that things were bad in the old days. Have they improved much?
Well, I hear people talk about in Charlotte, and I've been to Charlotte. I get there 2 or 3 times a year, and I've heard that on Trade and Tryon Street that you can walk up to people and it's a friendly town. I've never, but again, I don't go there a lot. I don't know, maybe I don't notice those kinds of things necessarily, mostly because I'm taking students and we go there and quickly come back. But
Nancy, quickly?
Well,
What do you think?
there's a history here as well. There was a deadlock jury in a 2013 shooting death of Jonathan Farrell, a former Florida A&M football player who was unarmed. He had a car accident. He knocked on a woman's door seeking help, and the response was to call 911. And then when an officer arrived on the scene, Farrell was shot. So again, I think we have to think about the set of assumptions that may underlie the violence, the deeper culture.
You know, one thing that makes it look better
We're going to have to wrap up, Mike.
is there's so much coding now that there wasn't before. But underneath it, I think, are some of the same feelings and prejudices.
Yeah,
Well,
we really need to talk about this in other shows.
yes.
We haven't had enough time.
We
Yeah.
don't. We're going to have to come back to the electorate. Of course, we're about 6 weeks away from the election now, so we'll be talking a lot more about the election and the electorate itself. But that's it for our time this week. I'm Paul Gates. Please join us next week for another edition of the Academics.